Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan for today's press conference. My name is David McNeil. I'll be your host. Well, today we are honored to host a man called Robert Bilott, who is an attorney. He was once on the other side of the legal barricades, but he is now an environmental campaigner, an environmental crusader. In his previous incarnation as a corporate lawyer, he defended chemical companies until his conscience was pricked by a West Virginia farmer whose land had been poisoned by runoff chemicals from a DuPont landfill. Mr. Bilott switched sides and battled for 2 decades all the way to a successful class action suit. This conversion, you can find it depicted in a very moving movie which I watched a couple of weeks ago called Dark Waters, made in 2019, which stars Mark Ruffalo and was directed by Todd Haynes. Mr. Bilott has now spent more than 30 years trying to expose the immense environmental costs of what we would call forever chemicals. The chemicals are used in everything from solar panels to cosmetics and have been linked to many health problems, including cancers and sterility. The New York Times Book Review described Mr. Bilott's best-selling book, Exposure, as a David versus Goliath tale that helped uncover the worst case of environmental contamination in history, affecting virtually every person on the planet. So the stakes could hardly be any higher. We are honored to welcome him, as I said. He will discuss briefly the history of the discovery of worldwide forever chemical contamination, the associated environmental and human health impacts, international regulatory and legislative responses, and the relevance of the story depicted in the movie Dark Waters, and of course his book Exposure. The same chemicals are beginning to be exposed in Japan. I think we have a question today from one of the people, I should say, who has helped expose them, John Mitchell. So that will be on the topic for discussion, chemicals in Okinawa, particularly around US bases there. Hi there, Mr. Bilott. How are you?
Very good, thank you. Thanks for having me.
No worries, thanks for coming. You're in northern Kentucky, I believe, and it's evening for you there, is that right?
Right. It's about 9 p.m. right now.
Do you want to make a brief presentation? Just tell us what your work is about.
Sure. Again, thanks so much for the opportunity to speak to everyone tonight. I really appreciate it. I'm Rob Bilott. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Taft, Stettinius & Hollister, operating out of Cincinnati, Ohio, and northern Kentucky. And I'm not here tonight on behalf of any of our clients or the firm, but here to try to tell you what I know about a massive public health threat, one that has now reached global proportions, involving these chemicals you just heard referred to as forever chemicals. I've been practicing 31 years now, and 22 of those years have been focused on trying to uncover what has been known about these chemicals and trying to find ways to bring that information out to the public, not just in the United States, but worldwide. Because these chemicals, over the last 60 or 70 years, have managed to pervade the entire planet. Contamination on an unprecedented global scale, where virtually every living creature on the planet, including in Japan, is now contaminated. Newborn babies being born are born pre-polluted with these chemicals. So I wanted to spend a little time to explain how the story that you'll see in the film that's being released in Japan in just a week or so, I think on December 17th, called Dark Waters. And the story, as you heard, that's referenced in my book, Exposure. It may begin in a small town in West Virginia, but it is a story that continues to this day. And it involves issues and concerns that impact all of us, including in Japan, today in Japan. I began my legal career in 1990, and for the first 8 years or so of that career, I was helping our clients. We are a large law firm, over 600 attorneys in multiple states and multiple cities. A lot of what I was doing at the time back then was helping our big corporate clients, like big chemical companies, comply with all the complex federal and state environmental laws. And one day in 1998, I got a call, and it was a gentleman on the other end of the line who identified himself as a farmer in West Virginia whose cows were dying. Now, that's not the kind of case that I typically took on, but it just so happened he was raising these animals near a town, Parkersburg, where my mother's family was from. So with that family connection, I agreed to listen to him. We met. He explained what was happening. His cows, he could see them drinking white foaming water coming out of a creek next to a landfill owned by a big chemical company down the road, the DuPont Chemical Company, one of the biggest employers in town. You could see the white foam coming out of this landfill. The cows were drinking this, getting sick, getting tumors, their teeth were turning black, and they were dropping dead. And it wasn't just the cows, it was the deer, fish, other wildlife in the area. He was convinced there was something in that water, but he wasn't getting any answers from the company. He wasn't getting answers from the state regulators or the federal regulators. So he had come to me looking for help. We took that case on in 1999, and that led to litigation that actually continues to this day. But through that litigation, we figured out what was going on in that landfill in West Virginia. There were thousands of tons of sludge containing a chemical called PFOA that had come from the nearby DuPont plant where they made Teflon. At the time, we had no idea what PFOA was. It wasn't on any lists in the United States of regulated or hazardous chemicals. In fact, there was little to no information available about this chemical. But through litigation against the company and court orders to get them, forcing them to turn over their documents, we found out that there was a lot that the company knew about this chemical going back to the 1950s and 60s. Completely man-made, didn't exist on the planet prior to World War II, had been invented primarily by 3M Company right after the war. And this chemical was unusual, didn't exist in nature, created by man by stringing carbons attached to fluorine, which as a lawyer, I didn't quite understand why that was important, but I learned from our scientific experts that made it incredibly strong, made it difficult for this stuff to break down once it got out into the environment. You hear this referred to now as a forever chemical because of that characteristic. This stuff, once it gets out into the world, it won't break down after thousands or perhaps millions of years because of the strong chemical bond. Made it incredibly useful in lots of different manufacturing processes, including Teflon, which is why DuPont had started buying it as early as 1951, using massive quantities down at this plant in West Virginia. But a lot of the waste from that plant had gone into this landfill. And when this stuff hits the water, it causes white foam. And what we started to see in these documents was, I couldn't find the chemical listed anywhere as being a regulated or hazardous material. So I assumed it must be okay. It must not be a bad chemical. It must not be one of the ones we have to be worried about. But as I started digging through the documents, what we saw was, despite it not being regulated, there was incredible information that the company had about incredibly toxic characteristics of this chemical, multiple different adverse effects in different animals that were tested over time, going back into the 1960s, showing it was not only incredibly toxic, that it could cause cancer in the animals that were exposed, in the rats. In the 1980s and 1990s, cancer studies confirming that that chemical could cause cancer, including testicular tumors in the rats. And not only was it toxic and could it get out and stay in the environment, if people were exposed to it, it would get in them and it would build up in blood over time. So it was not only toxic, it was persistent. In that as we were exposed to more and more, it built up to higher and higher levels. Our bodies didn't know how to excrete it. So it was persistent, bioaccumulative, toxic. Yet, unfortunately, the U.S. environmental laws regulating chemicals like this really didn't come out until the late 1970s. And at that point, they really focused on new chemicals from that point forward. So an existing chemical like this that had been out there since the 1950s, under U.S. law, it was essentially up to the companies that were using or making them to alert the US EPA or the regulators if there were any concerns about toxicity or problems to the environment. And despite everything I was seeing in these internal studies, the company hadn't alerted the agencies. So it wasn't on any lists of regulated chemicals because the regulators didn't even know it existed. Yet what I saw was the company itself, the scientists, were very concerned about this toxicity, persistence, bioaccumulation, cancer-causing potential. They had sat down and said, what would be a safe level if people outside of the factory were exposed to it? And they set a guideline by earliest 1988, no more than 1 part per billion, which was about the lowest you could even detect it in water at the time, using the company's own methods. They went out and tested water supplies in the 1980s and found it in the drinking water at levels above that guideline. But again, didn't report it and didn't tell anybody. So I'm looking at all these documents and seeing all this, and we figured out what had happened to these cows. They had been drinking this foam that was contaminated with this toxic, bioaccumulative, carcinogenic chemical. So we were able to settle that case for that farmer. But what we realized at that point was we had a much bigger issue on our hands. We had entire communities surrounding this plant that had been drinking this in their water for likely a long time and had no idea. And so what we began to understand was it wasn't just in that community either. This chemical wasn't just being used by DuPont to make Teflon. This chemical and a related chemical called PFOS, a very similar chemical, both had 8 carbons attached to fluorine, both manufactured by 3M at the time. These C8s were incredibly useful in all these different manufacturing products, so had been used not only in making Teflon, but in making things like Scotchgard, in making certain types of firefighting foam, aqueous film forming foam, a type of foam used to combat petroleum-based fires, fast food wrappers and packaging coatings, stain-resistant carpeting, clothing, cosmetics, computer chips, dental floss, you name it. So we were realizing this chemical, which is now getting into drinking water outside this plant, is likely in water all over the country. And not only in the United States, but we started to realize this could be a global problem. Because not only, for example, if you looked at just DuPont wasn't just handling this chemical at their facility in West Virginia. They also were handling it at a large facility in New Jersey, a very large facility in Dordrecht in the Netherlands. And what their 4th biggest facility handling this? In Shimizu, Japan. So we're seeing all these documents and realizing this stuff is being emitted into the air. It's going out into the water at these facilities all over. The government regulators are unaware of this. The public is unaware. This is incredibly toxic stuff, according to the company's own documents. So I sat down and started preparing letters. We realized we had a massive public health threat, starting alerting public agencies as early as 2001. That led to the community in West Virginia coming to us and asking us to help them get this out of their water and help them figure out what's it going to do to us in the long term. This information that I started providing to the regulators prompted the US EPA to sue DuPont in 2004 for having withheld information. As that information finally started to bubble out a little bit in the United States back in 2004, the companies that were still handling this chemical, PFOA, announced that they would phase that out. They entered into an agreement, and this included several Japanese companies at the time, Daikin, Asahi Glass. They agreed to start phasing out any further use of PFOA in the United States over the next 10 years. They also DuPont settled its case that the US EPA had brought against it. And they then settled the case in West Virginia, where they agreed to provide clean drinking water. But we also wanted to address the issue that had not yet been addressed. Could this chemical actually cause disease in the people that were exposed to it, that were drinking it in their water at the levels they were actually drinking it? Nobody had done a study like that yet. The workers had been studied. We saw all kinds of adverse health effects. Animals had been studied, but the companies were denying that any of that related to the levels that the people were drinking. So we we created a pretty unique process where we actually sat down with DuPont in 2004, and we set up a process where we had independent scientists, not affiliated with the companies, not affiliated with us, independent scientists who would be tasked with looking at all of the data, not just what the companies had chosen to publish by that point, but also all of the internal studies that hadn't been published, and do new studies of the exposed people in these communities to confirm whether or not drinking this chemical could actually cause disease. And what we did is we defined the group to be studied by the level of exposure. We said people who were exposed for at least a year to 50 parts per trillion of PFOA or more would be the group to be studied. Nobody had really done this before. We ended up getting 69,000 people in that community who came forward, provided blood samples, provided medical information. All of this was turned over to these independent scientists. This process cost over $100 million to do. To take all of this raw data from these people, do all of these studies. These scientists designed over 12 different new epidemiological studies. They did some of the largest human health studies in human history on this chemical. It took them 7 years. By 2012, when this process was complete, those independent scientists were able to confirm that drinking this chemical, PFOA, at the levels these people in this community, the people who were drinking it more than 50 parts per trillion for a year or more, was linked with 6 different diseases: kidney cancer, testicular cancer, ulcerative colitis, thyroid disease, preeclampsia, and high cholesterol. When that data finally came out in 2012, for the first time, federal regulators in the US said we need to start looking to see if this chemical and that sister chemical, PFOS, whether they're in drinking water in other places across the country, or whether this is just in West Virginia. Sampling began in 2013 and 2014 all over the United States. Sure enough, these chemicals were being found, but they really weren't being regulated yet. Things changed in 2016 when the New York Times Magazine published an article that summarized this story and pointed out the fact that this wasn't just in the water in West Virginia. This chemical, PFOA, and the related chemical, PFOS, were likely being found all over the United States now. That led to the US EPA, just a couple months later, coming out with their first drinking water guideline for these chemicals in May of 2016, no more than 70 parts per trillion. That prompted an avalanche of new activity in the United States, particularly by the Department of Defense, the US military, because they realized that these chemicals, PFOA and PFOS, one of these products I mentioned before that they had been used in, these firefighting foams, those foams, when you think about it, you use them by spraying them out into the environment. And so the Department of Defense was concerned that there could be serious water contamination outside of military bases, airports, fire stations all over the country, and frankly, elsewhere in the world where these foams were used at military bases. So sampling begins in late 2016, early 2017, outside military bases, airports, fire stations. From that point forward, almost every day, a new community is finding out that these chemicals are in their water. The process at the federal level, though, to regulate these is incredibly slow. So in US states started moving forward with adopting even more stringent guidelines for these chemicals. US EPA's level of 70 parts per trillion in 2016, states that looked at it after that point and started looking at additional science that was coming out, started setting numbers that were even lower, 20 parts per trillion, 14, 10. Now we're looking at single-digit part per trillion safety guidelines. So you have this massive testing going on across the country. Plus, we're now realizing at the time that the company started phasing out PFOA between 2005 and 2015, they started bringing out replacements for this chemical, things that had, instead of C8s, maybe a couple fewer carbons, C6s, C4s. A replacement, for example, that DuPont had for PFOA called Gen X starts getting put into a lot of these same products. So people start realizing we don't just have PFOA and PFOS. We have related man-made perfluorochemicals also in the water. And these things are not just getting into the water. Sampling is finding that they're in human blood across the world. 99% of the people in the United States. Elsewhere where the sampling is occurring, they're finding it there. It's being found in the blood of polar bears. It's being found in wildlife all over the world. Because once this stuff gets into the environment, it can move through the air, gets into air droplets, and follows as the clouds move across the planet in rain. It moves through the water, it moves through the soil, it stays in our blood. So it's incredibly mobile, but also very persistent, and it stays there. So all of this that's been emitted over the last 70 years is still out there. So as this testing is beginning, and these chemicals are being found, we're realizing that we have all these additional perfluorochemicals out there. We now refer to all of these as PFAS, PFAS. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of these chemicals that have this man-made carbon-fluorine bond. So we now see regulators and countries all over the world that are looking at how do we address this big group of these man-made chemicals. So we're seeing laws and regulations requiring these to be addressed. And as this story was finally coming out, when the New York Times Magazine article came out in 2016 and all this was finally starting to come out in the United States, I got a call one day from Mark Ruffalo. And he had just read the New York Times Magazine article and said, how is this happening? How is this happening in the United States? Contamination of the whole country, and no one is talking about it. Why is it on the front page of the New York Times Magazine, but not on the front page of the New York Times? How do we get this story out to the world? And that's when he approached the idea of doing a film, Dark Waters. And luckily, they had an incredible team that came together in 2019 and filmed this story, and shows you what that community in West Virginia went through, what it took over 20 years to bring this information out to the rest of the world. And these are chemicals that have likely been out there and in our water, in our soil, in our air, in the vegetation that takes this stuff up for a long time. And we're just now becoming aware of it. And we're seeing that as the sampling begins in Europe, you see massive contamination in Italy, in Germany, in Sweden. We're seeing in Australia, in New Zealand. It's everywhere where you start to sample and look for it. So the story that you see in the film, Dark Waters, or in my book, Exposure, which just gives a little more of the background and the detail, is an incredibly important one and timely, particularly for folks in Japan. As the testing is starting in areas of Japan, outside military bases, there's been great reporting by folks like John Mitchell about this, or outside of where some of these other factories have been, like Daikin, and there's been reporting, I think, by Tanza that's also looked at this. Or I've even seen reference to these chemicals being found in wells in Tokyo. That people need to be aware of what these chemicals are, what we know about them, the health threat that they pose, and what we can do about it. Because we're seeing that as this information's gotten out, as the story has spread, and people become aware of this, and changes are being demanded, this is getting fixed. We're getting laws passed. Companies are moving away from these chemicals. Even through market forces, consumers are demanding that the companies switch away and start producing products without this. We're seeing carpet manufacturers do this. We're seeing clothing retailers, fast food companies, all publicly coming out now and saying we are moving away from these chemicals. We had the President of the United States in public speeches talking about the need now to address these forever chemicals, allocating over $10 billion in the US just recently to try to clean these up. The US EPA just came out and said, we will regulate these in the United States. And they released new guidance documents about the health effects that suggest the levels in the water that should be appropriate are going to be going a lot lower than 70 parts per trillion based on the new science. Because a lot of what the new science is showing, and I'll try to wrap this up so you can ask questions. A lot of what the new science is showing, since all those studies were done in 2012 with the linking with the 6 diseases, we also now know through even more recent science that these chemicals are linked with impairing our immune systems. It may even affect the efficiency and efficacy of vaccines, something that's truly disturbing in the time of a massive global pandemic. Here we have chemicals circulating throughout the globe, man-made chemicals in our water, in our food, in products, in our blood that may impair our immune function or decrease the effectiveness of vaccines. So this is getting the attention of scientists worldwide right now. And it is something that is critically important for the public to be aware of and to understand and to realize that there are things that can be done. If you become aware, you can require that the water be tested and the water can be cleaned. It is possible to clean this out of the water. These things can be removed and products can be changed, but it starts with the public becoming aware and understanding. And I'm hopeful that with the movie coming out, with the book, with other books like John Mitchell's and others about this story, that this public health threat, the important message here will make its way into Japan as well. And we can do what we need to do to protect the public all over the globe. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you this evening. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Thanks so much, Rob. Well, you're under 30 minutes, so we've lots of time. Thanks very much for sticking to the time. Well, you've mentioned this a few times already. The first question actually is from John Mitchell. It's an online question. I'll just read it out. In Okinawa Prefecture, the drinking water sources for 450,000 residents has been contaminated with elevated levels of PFAS. But there are currently no plans by the national or local authorities to conduct health surveys for residents. Can you offer any advice for NGOs or citizens groups on the most effective ways to conduct large-scale health checks within their communities?
It's a great question. And unfortunately, it's a difficult one. It's a difficult one that health officials all over the world are grappling with right now. It's one thing to be able to address the drinking water. Filters can be put on. They're expensive, but it can be done, and they're effective to remove these chemicals from the water to at least stop that exposure. But doing the studies then to verify, what's happened in the populations. Fortunately, we have massive studies that have already been done of communities exposed to PFOA, people exposed for a year or more over 50 parts per trillion, which just so happens to be the guideline that I believe is being used in Japan right now, is the 50 parts per trillion. We've got those massive epidemiology studies that have been done, and that data should be used. And hopefully people won't have to go back and repeat that and do that over again. Those studies are out there. That data is, in fact, the kind of data that is being relied upon by agencies worldwide, including in the United States, by the US EPA. Those health studies are seen as critical in helping to flesh out what the potential health effects are. Because getting the funding to do those studies is difficult. And to do studies that are big enough to be able to confirm these kinds of health effects. I mean, we had 70,000 people. They cost tens of millions, if not more, to do that. So it's important to have access to and know that there are studies out there that can be used and relied upon, and to get the funding in place to do any additional studies that need to be done of these exposed populations. For example, there's a lot of new studies going on with a highly exposed population involving another 70,000 or so people in the Veneto region in Italy right now. So there are new studies being conducted there Some of the scientists who worked on our studies in West Virginia are working on those studies. So we've got some of the best minds doing it, but these are expensive. And one of the things we're really struggling with in the United States is making sure that the taxpayers, the people who've been exposed, aren't the ones stuck having to pay for these studies and to do these things. And so there's unfortunately, a lot of litigation that's continuing to this day against these companies to try to get them to pay the costs, not only to clean this stuff up, but to do whatever science is still needed to tell us exactly what these are going to do to us. You know, you see in the film Dark Waters, the litigation up through the point where we were able to resolve cases for the community in West Virginia. Since that time, as I mentioned, unfortunately, testing has confirmed that this is all over. We've now got litigation going on all over the United States now, trying to recover the costs involved in cleaning this up, getting clean water, getting those health studies done. Critically important, and it's critically important that the truly responsible people are the ones paying those costs.
Thank you. Since you brought up the movie, Rob, were you happy with it? I mean, my sense from watching it was that you were very much initially a reluctant warrior, that you had to be converted. Do you want to just tell us how you felt about the movie? It must have been weird seeing yourself up there.
It was. That was a surreal experience, that's for sure. You know, I was initially very reluctant about this whole idea. But, you know, after talking with Mark Ruffalo, Todd Haynes, the people at Participant Media, you know, that putting this project together, it was clear that they were committed to doing the film for the right reasons and doing it the right way. You know, sticking to the reality of what actually happened, showing what this community really went through. In fact, a lot of it was filmed in our actual law offices in Cincinnati. Using a lot of the real people. You see a lot of the folks who were involved from this community, some of the family members in the film, including from my family. I was able to consult with them during the process, during the filming. So I think they did an incredible job, a fantastic job in taking a story that involves a lot of science and a lot of law, a lot of complicated things, and condensing it in a way that you really understand the reality of what happened, why it's important, and I think also with a really inspirational message that people, even one person, standing up and speaking out can take on some of the biggest forces in society, and change can happen. It may take a long time, but it's doable, and it happened here, and it can happen elsewhere. So I'm hoping that people are inspired when they see the film, and know what this community went through, and are able to appreciate what they were able to do for the rest of us.
Well, I do recommend everyone sees the movie, obviously. Rob, do you just want to tell us about your conversion moment, your Damascus moment, when you sort of crossed the barricades? Can you tell us what the moment was? When did you because that was a huge move, right? I mean, you were a corporate lawyer and you switched sides. Must have been very traumatic.
Yeah, I'm still at the same law firm. I've been here now over 31 years at the Taft firm. I'm still there. We have a unique law firm. It was some incredible people. I'm not sure how many other law firms would have done what we did. But we have a strong belief that when you take on representation of a client, you do to the best of your ability, regardless of who they are. And in this case, when I first met with Mr. Tennant and his family about what was happening with his cows, we had no idea actually at the time that it was going to turn into something involving contamination of the planet. At the time, we thought it was a fairly narrow, simple case for one family. But when we saw what we ended up learning, that this was an incredible public health threat, that it was going unnoticed, we really felt that we had an obligation to do what we could to help alert the public, the regulators, the scientists about what we were seeing. After all, we were like one of the only people out there that had seen these documents outside the company. So again, I'm incredibly privileged to be with lawyers in a firm that saw that and understood that that's what we needed to do, and that was the right thing to do, and that was the right decision.
Thank you. We have a question from Natalie Stuckey, who is with a media outlet called Media One. She wants to know, is graphene, that's Graphene, graphene, a molecule manipulation similar to Teflon? And is it also a forever chemical? She's saying it took 40 years to understand the consequences of Teflon. Is there also graphene in other places? And she mentions the COVID-19 vaccine. So I think it's a vaccine question.
I have to admit, I am not familiar with graphene. What I can say is we are learning every day about additional PFAS chemicals that are out there. And unfortunately, as we learn about even the new ones, a lot of the toxicity information is just starting to come out and showing that even some of the new ones share some of the same toxicity as the old ones. For example, when I mentioned that DuPont had stopped making the C8 PFOA and started making a C6 called Gen X. Well, I was touted as the safe replacement chemical. Well, when the first cancer study finally came out of Gen X, it showed that it caused the same 3 tumors in rats that PFOA did. So that's why we've got this concern among scientists now that it's incredibly important that we understand where are these PFAS chemicals, what are they, and answer questions like, is it called this or is it called that, and then try to figure out where were they emitted, what products are they in, so that we can at least start to understand where the exposures may be, and if they're toxic, how we stop that exposure going forward.
Thank you. Well, I've got 3 children like you, I believe. You have 3 children, is that right?
Yes.
Yep. And we watched the movie together, and then we had a discussion about the contents, and we got straight down to brass tacks. We said, well, where are these chemicals? And we wondered straight away if non-stick frying pans were a source. Teflon on frying pans, of course. I guess the question is, how do we avoid being paranoid about these kind of chemicals, or should we be paranoid about them? And how do you protect your children on an individual basis?
It's extremely difficult. It really is. As I mentioned before, these chemicals have been used in so many different products, in so many different types of products over the years. It's almost impossible to avoid them. And the best you can do is try to become educated on what types of products have they been used in, and try to get information from the manufacturers, whether they're still using them or whether they've moved away. That's not easy to do. In a lot of these situations, unfortunately, the companies that made the chemicals may know where they are or who they sold them to, but the people downstream, some of the customers that then put them into products, may never have known they were getting them. Because you have to remember, a lot of these chemicals, most of them, if not all of them, were never regulated. So they didn't end up on ingredient lists or product labels or warning lists. So unfortunately, even though they may have been used for decades and decades, there wasn't much information out there about what they were being used in. We're only just starting to learn that now. And a lot of that information is still being claimed confidential business information. And so there are groups out there, like in the United States, the Green Science Policy Institute, Center for Environmental Health, Environmental Working Group, groups that are trying to help educate the public about what types of products have these been used in, and then also helping to elevate awareness of here are the companies that have now pledged to not use them going forward. So at least try to provide market incentives and an ability for consumers who want to make that choice to be able to make that choice. Because up to now, none of us had a choice in this. None of us were asked, do we want to be exposed? Do we want this in our blood? It was done to us without us even knowing. So step one in stopping that is to at least start to become aware of how we've been exposed and give us some ability to start making choices to avoid that. Again, that's why it's so critically important for events like this, where we can have a discussion and hopefully help make people aware that these are the questions to be asking.
So avoid cheap frying pans?
Well, historically, PFOA was used in making Teflon and other nonstick coatings. During that period we talked about, 2006 to 2015, when the company started moving away and phasing out PFOA, they started bringing in these replacement chemicals, things like like Gen X. Those replacement chemicals are still, a lot of them, within the PFAS family of chemicals, the ones we're concerned about, the ones with carbon and fluorine. And unfortunately, it's very confusing for consumers. For example, in the United States, we may now see ads on television now that say, here's a nonstick pan, PFOA free, meaning it doesn't have PFOA. Well, that's great, but that doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't have PFAS, one of the other related or replacement chemicals. So there's even legislation that's been passed now in the United States, like in California, just passed legislation to try to rein that in and make labeling clearer so that people will know, are they really getting a product that doesn't have these chemicals or just not one of them? So it's an evolving area right now.
Thank you. We have a speaker in the room, or a question in the room here. This is Teddy Jimbo, is the boss of video.com. Videonews.com, my mistake, Teddy, sorry. And he's also the co-chair of our events committee here. Teddy?
Mr. Bilott, it's a real honor for us to have you at FCCJ. It's kind of a follow-up question on the David's point. Now we're beginning to know the seriousness of this PFOA, PFOS contamination in Japan as well, thanks to John Mitchell's effort in Okinawa. And there are some reports that underground water in Tokyo is also contaminated because there are some U.S. bases in the Western Tokyo. Though we don't really have a detailed information, but to compare with the contamination near the U.S. bases and maybe some of the factories that actually uses the chemical. First of all, how serious do you see? How serious is it that the contamination caused by sort of everyday products such as the frying pan that he mentioned, the use of Teflon, and fortunately in Japan, the new legislation was passed in only 2 months ago that restricts the use of PFOA and PFOS. Not completely, but with under somewhat strict conditions. But where does the U.S. regulations or legislation stands right now? Because we can buy frying pans from U.S. through Amazon freely in Japan. So it almost doesn't matter how strict the Japanese law is, because you can buy frying pan from anywhere through Amazon. And we like to know where the legislation stands. And my understanding is that there's actually a treaty, Stockholm Treaty, signed in 2019, which actually bans the use of PFOA and PFOS. So I think the signatory of the treaty are obliged to pass the law, but I don't know how many countries have actually, passed the law to go along with the treaty. If you can update us on that, thank you.
Sure, great question. Unfortunately, this has been moving very slowly in the United States, particularly at the federal level. In fact, we've been trying to get action like this. Gosh, my first letter to the US EPA on all of this was in March of 2001, so 20 years. Now we're seeing a lot of activity now, a lot of bills, a lot of legislation being proposed. but not much is getting passed at the federal level yet. There is still not, for example, a federal drinking water standard, an actual enforceable limit at the national level in the United States. The US EPA just announced that they will do that, but it just hasn't happened yet. States are doing that. We are seeing laws being passed in the US, though, that are starting to ban the use of these chemicals at the state level. For example, in firefighting foams, or in clothing, or in food packaging. That's happening in various states, but not necessarily at the federal level yet. And so there's a lot of folks that are trying to get a coordinated nationwide approach to that, but it quite hasn't happened yet. We have voluntary phase outs of PFOA and PFOS in the United States. Those were done voluntarily by the companies. And so we still don't have enforceable limits. As you mentioned, there are international treaties that are addressing these compounds. But again, as you also pointed out, it may vary depending on who signed those. So it's right now sort of a patchwork of different rules, different standards that apply in different countries. And in fact, we even have the industry now saying we would like a nationwide standard, or frankly, even an international one, to avoid all of these different standards and different rules that are now popping up in different countries, in different states, within countries. And so it's incredibly confusing right now, and particularly for consumers to understand, what is safe, what is not safe. Is there a safe level? And in fact, there are a lot of scientists that are now coming to the conclusion, that are now saying there may not be a safe level for these materials in water or in blood. And as you indicated, testing, there may not have even yet been comprehensive testing of all these different water supplies for these chemicals. One thing, I'm sorry for the long answer here, but one thing to also keep in mind is even after you stop using these chemicals to make various products, this stuff is going to remain in the garbage or the trash, in landfills, all over the place. Particularly in the United States, at least, a lot of our trash ends up in landfills that may not have liners or may not be really carefully constructed because they assume they are not dealing with hazardous or toxic waste. So a lot of these chemicals could be in these landfills, and we're finding that they're seeping into the groundwater under landfills, or from wastewater treatment plants that accept wastewater from not only coming from homes when the toilet's flushed, but coming from businesses in a city, all flows into a wastewater plant. And at least in the United States, a lot of those plants will generate sludge, a biosludge. And historically, they've given that away to farmers to put on fields, agricultural fields, to use as fertilizer. And unfortunately, we're now finding out that sludge ends up being concentrated PFAS that is being now found to be taken up into the roots in the crops that are grown on the soil, getting into the farm animals as well, possibly contaminating the food crops. So stopping the ongoing manufacturing is one thing, but we still have to also then worry about what do we do about what's already out there that's already been disposed of, that's sitting in our landfills, that's in our wastewater, that's in the sludges, that's been applied all over the ground. So it's a huge technical and scientific challenge at this point.
Thank you. So just if I could ask a follow-up question, while the legislative and corporate kind of gears ground on, what simple advice do you give to people, Rob, to avoid? What products would you avoid? I mean, we've already talked about frying pans. What about bentos, for example? Japan, they use a lot of plastic here in plastic lunch boxes. Do you tell people? Do you give that kind of advice? Do you say avoid certain things? These are the worst offenders, or do you stay clear of that sort of stuff?
Again, those groups that I mentioned earlier, like the Environmental Working Group, Green Science Policy, Center for Environmental Health, Safer States, those groups have a lot of lists like that will identify the different types of products. Some of the main ones that have been identified to date, and we're still learning about where these chemicals have been used, have primarily been firefighting foams. That's a huge one to getting out into the environment, or biosludge from wastewater treatment plants. But stain-resistant waterproof clothing, anything that's got a fabric protection to make them stain-proof or waterproof, including the type of turnout gear that firemen have historically worn. That's something that's just been discovered, that material may historically have been coated with a lot of this, and that could possibly be breaking down and being in the dust in firehouses. There's studies going on in the United States right now about that. And firefighters all over the world are very concerned about not only that, but of course the firefighting foam. But another big source of where these chemicals have been used historically is in food packaging and wrappers, particularly fast food, things that kept grease from soaking through. Pizza boxes, microwave popcorn bags, hamburger wrappers, those kinds of things. And we've seen major fast food chains, at least in the United States, recently come out and say, we are now not going to use those anymore. Carpets historically have been coated with these things, and carpet retailers have now said they're not going to make these. Recent studies have also shown that these are in an incredible amount of cosmetics, particularly things that are identified as being waterproof, building materials, computer chips. It's an incredible array. But the things I think have been really identified as the most concerning have historically been the firefighting foams, the clothing and waterproofing materials, and the food wrapping. Those kinds of things generally have the most use and could generate the most exposure.
Thank you. Teddy, you have a follow-up question? Yeah, sorry, just a follow-up question from Teddy Jimbo. Rob.
Mr. Bilott, since you mentioned the fire extinguisher, or the source of the contamination in Tokyo are now suspected to be the fire, they call emergency drill, using the fire extinguisher in Yokota Air Base. In Yokota, it's only an air base, and they don't have any actual sort of exercise or drills that using fire, but they do have a drill that extinguishes fire. So and there's actually it was confirmed that there is a training ground for the emergency drill using the fire extinguisher.
Right.
In the U.S., is there any cases where there's actually a confirmed the contamination near the U.S. Near the military bases, where they don't do the excesses involving the firearms? However, still there is a contamination as a result of the emergency drill, because every U.S. base will conduct the emergency drill using fire extinguisher. So if you can just give us your experience, yeah.
Absolutely. And in fact, what we have found, in fact, right now there are hundreds, if not thousands, of cases going on in the U.S. involving claims for exposure to PFAS from firefighting foams, in particularly outside of military bases or firehouses or airports. And what we have found through that litigation is that the vast majority of the foam usage outside of these various places is from training, not from any actual accident or fire, but that this foam, unfortunately, has been used in training exercises where it didn't need to be used. But the firemen, the folks on the base, were never told by the manufacturers, not that this stuff might have PFAS in it or be dangerous, and to be encouraged to use something else during training. Instead, that we've had all of this exposure that didn't have to happen through training exercises. In fact, there's a facility in the United States, in Wisconsin, that was a major fire training facility where people would go to be trained on the different firefighting foams. And it ended up contaminating private wells, drinking water wells all around the area in Wisconsin. We actually had one of the first settlements in the country involved that site, a fire training facility. So, one of the things that is happening right now because of this and because of what we've learned here is in the United States, some of the legislation that is going through is legislation that is saying that from this point forward, you shouldn't be using foams containing PFAS in any training exercises. They should be, if you're going to use them at all, only be used for actual fires and actual events where you actually may need them. Don't be using them in these training exercises. So, what you've described, unfortunately, is fairly common, that there is a lot of this that has been discharged out into the environment through just regular training because no one was told by the manufacturers that there was any problem in doing that. And unfortunately, we're only learning about that now.
Thank you very much. Next question. We've got two more left, if that's okay. We'll try and squeeze them in. We have 5 minutes. The next question is from Pio D'Emilia of Sky TG24. He's also the co-chair of our event committee here. Have you ever been subject to threats or offered bribes, is Pio's question.
What I can tell you is, and you see this in the film, and I talk about it in the book, Exposure, is when I first started uncovering all of this, and I first signed up to go speak to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to try to provide them this information. DuPont actually went into court to try to get what we call a gag order, tried to get an order to prevent me from being able to speak publicly about this. Luckily, the court didn't allow that, and I was able to go and speak with US EPA, and this information came out. Again, I think there's been a lot of effort over the years to try to prevent this story from emerging in different manners, and in fact, it continues to this day to try to frankly mislead the media about what the science has shown about these chemicals. We still have people standing up, even in front of the U.S. Congress, and claiming that there's never been any science that's ever shown any effects from these chemicals that caused any harm to people. Despite everything that had been done that we talked about earlier, the 7 years of independent studies confirming links with 6 diseases, all these additional studies. We saw that with tobacco. We've seen it with other cases where it's called manufacturing doubt. Just keep saying we don't know enough. There's not enough information. The science isn't clear yet. That's one of the main reasons why I did the book Exposure and why I wanted to make sure the film came out, Dark Waters, is so that what we actually do know, what the science does show, it's there. People can go look for themselves and see the facts for themselves. Hopefully that would put an end to this narrative, that we just don't know, that the science doesn't show any problem. Hopefully that will finally come to an end.
Thank you. I think this will be the last question. This is from Aya Okadome. She's actually one of my students, my media students at the University of Sacred Heart in Tokyo. She says that the industry groups have said that the use of PFAS-related products is widely banned or will be widely banned in the future, but there may be no alternatives available for the approximately 600 PFAS used in cell phones, solar panels, etc. Can you confirm that's true, and is there anything that can be done about that? So they're saying that there's certain products that these chemicals cannot be removed from.
Well, I think that remains to be seen. In fact, that's the same kind of argument I've seen being made for the last 20 years, that essentially this is too big to regulate. We've put it into so many products and so many things that if you dare to try to regulate it now, you're going to shut the economy down. Everything's going to fall apart and everybody's going to lose their jobs. That's the argument that we've been hearing for years. Of course, and now as things are heating up, now we're seeing efforts to try to connect it to very popular items like cell phones or 5G or things of that nature. But what I can tell you is in situations where, let me give you an example. In Denmark, they actually were concerned about the microwave popcorn bags I mentioned earlier. And efforts were actually taken to ban the use of PFAS in the microwave popcorn bags. At the time, the folks in the industry were saying, we can't make this without the PFAS chemicals. This will shut us down. And the folks from the Danish organization that was involved there actually came to a seminar and presented the data to show that it was only a matter of months before folks were able to develop the coatings without PFAS, and the microwave popcorn was back on the shelves in Denmark. So the innovative process and the ability to come up with replacements is definitely there, and it's definitely happened. So I think that needs to be taken for with a grain of salt when you hear that argument.
Popcorn, a grain of salt. Well, look, thanks so much for coming today and telling us about your work, Rob. I know people find it fascinating, and everybody in the room, everybody who's listening, knows the costs that this has built up for you in particular. We'll just rephrase the information that you gave at the start of the press conference. So, Dark Waters, the movie about your fight with DuPont, opens in Japan on December the 17th. Is that right?
I believe so, yes.
Your book, has that been translated into Japanese, or is there any plans to do that?
Unfortunately, it's only in English at this point. No, it's only in an English version at this point.
Right. Well, who knows? Maybe somebody is listening. I can see a few people, even in the room, might be tempted to take that one up. So hopefully it'll be available in Japanese soon. Thanks so much to Robert Bilott, attorney, author, and environmental campaigner. I'm sure we'll be hearing more from him. And thanks for everybody who joined us here at the FCCJ. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Bye.